Well, good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It's great to see you all joining us today. And thank you for joining us for what is going to be a celebration of the launch of Partners in Deterrence, a book that's been brought to you by two well-known academics and scholars, Professor Andrew O'Neill and Professor Stefan Frühling. So, this book is really described as a study that combines historical research, political science, and policy analysis. And in it, our authors provide a really comprehensive account of nuclear weapons cooperation in the context of US alliances. The book asks a couple of fundamental questions. What motivates states to form nuclear alliances, and what keeps them there? Some questions that are really relevant, I think, not just for drawing on lessons of the past, but certainly for the way that we think about contemporary events today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute here at Griffith University in Queensland. And it's a real pleasure for me to be your moderator for today's discussion. Let me begin firstly in the spirit of reconciliation by celebrating and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. For me and for Andrew here in Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. For many of our panellists in Canberra, they are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region. And of course, I acknowledge that many of you are joining us from many traditional lands across the widest reaches of this virtual platform. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples, including those who are joining us today. So I'm delighted to be able to share a couple of different conversations with you, and it's worth just acknowledging our special guest here today, Professor Hugh White, who will be joining us to provide some reflections of his own before officially launching this book. Many of you, of course, will know Hugh. For several decades, his work has brought a focus on Australian strategic and defence policy and Asia-Pacific security issues and global strategic affairs, especially as they influence Australia and the Asia-Pacific. His expertise and his provocations enrich and sharpen the quality of debate in this field. Hugh, as always, it's a real pleasure to share the podium with you, and I look forward to hearing from you a little later on. But first, let's come to our two authors. And I'll introduce them to you, although I know many of you will know them already. Professor Stefan Frühling, who teaches in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU, Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, who is widely published on Australian defence policy, defence planning and strategy, nuclear weapons and NATO. Great to see you, Stefan. And Professor Andrew O'Neill, one of my colleagues here at Griffith University, who's also published widely in the broad areas of international relations and strategic studies, and is currently chief investigator on projects focusing on Australia and the US alliance, funded by the Australian Research Council and the Australian Department of Defence. So I'd like to start with you two and really throw a couple of questions to you about the book. In the introduction, and this is really to you, Stefan, in the introduction, you both talk about the fact that this book is the product of a shared fascination with the dynamic interrelationship between alliance management and nuclear deterrence. Tell us a little bit more about this fascination, and really what was the motivation behind putting a fascination like this into the research and ultimately this book?
No, thank you. Now, originally, this book arose out of a research project that started looking at the question of why actually have US allies who are supposedly so needy, if you like, in their search for extended nuclear deterrence, why have so many allies actually at times refused to engage with refused to kind of like draw more closely in US nuclear weapons cooperation than they could have. And I think that in addition to that, we wanted to kind of bridge a bit the gap between a lot of the scholarship in regards to extended deterrence that looks at Europe and the Indo-Pacific. But because of that separately look at these two regions, kind of didn't really, to us, get at the differences and similarities systematically between those two. But as we kind of like developed that research, we realized that like looking at it in this way assumes that extended deterrence is kind of like a consistent thing, and the only question across time and space, and the only question is how much of that allies actually want or the US is willing to give. And as we delved into the historical record, that didn't really seem to gel with us in what was actually going on, in the types of objectives that the Allies are looking for. And so this book really, then this project and the book that resulted really then refocused a bit, if you like, on that core question of what actually is the role of nuclear weapons in the way that the US and their and US allies have negotiated and bargained, if you like, and defined the terms of their alliance relationships over time, without assuming that if you like, some standard and consistent definition of deterrence actually captures those dynamics.
We're going to come back to that and kind of, I guess, unpick some of that, the similarities and differences potentially in a second. But Andrew, if I can come to you, I was really struck, by the reference. The first line in the introduction actually refers to President Trump. And I quote, you make the point, during Donald Trump's term as US president, doubts began to emerge about whether his administration would deliver on established US commitments to defend its allies around the world. I think this is a really important point, and I wondered if you could just tease that out a little for us, from the perspective of US allies. How significant is the role and even the nature or temperament of the US leader to the resilience of the alliance itself?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Well, I think our book shows pretty clearly that not only are institutions important, but agents in the process are really key as well. And so when we submitted the manuscript, it was really in the shadow of a potential second term for Donald Trump. So in mid-2020, when we submitted, a lot of people were saying that Trump was probably odds on to be to have two terms. So for us, it was really a question of, well, here you had a president who had been openly trashing NATO, for example, calling out what he saw as kind of free-riding US allies in the Indo-Pacific. Could these alliances survive a second term of Donald Trump? And I think what we saw in the first term was really US institutions kind of stepping up, particularly the military, but also other institutions in the US government, to sort of keep these alliances on the straight and narrow, despite what the president was saying. And so what's interesting here for us is that when you look back in history, and you don't have to go too far back in history to realize that that's happened before. And the Carter administration, for example, Jimmy Carter's announcements in 1977 that the United States would withdraw all combat forces and all nuclear weapons from South Korea by 1982. Essentially, Carter was stymied by the US government. US institutions kind of reacted to that, pushed back against that, and by the end of his term, you might have had a reduction of maybe 10 or 15,000 US ground forces, but really that was quite minimal in the overall scheme of things and fell far short of his objective. The other kind of case here would be in the early 1960s, where the Kennedy administration started to push forward its strategy of flexible response and kind of caught quite a few NATO European members off guard. And the US sort of learnt from that and started to introduce greater consultation mechanisms after the Athens Guidelines in 1962. And by the formation of the Nuclear Planning Group in 1967, what you had was a 5-year period where the US had kind of learned from its initial misstep around non-consultation and had started to institutionalize the alliance more. That was possible because of the leadership of McNamara as US Defense Secretary. So I guess, the role of leaders has been really important in the US, but also in allied countries. When you think of people like Helmut Schmidt in the West German context, Yasuhiro Nakasone in Japan, and Australia's own Kim Beazley as kind of defence intellectuals who could seriously engage their US counterparts. So in short, for us, the role of leaders was crucial.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's something we'll come back to and chat about with Hugh as well, actually. Stefan, one last question to you. One of the unique aspects of this book is that it goes beyond, really traditional accounts of nuclear cooperation, which do tend to focus on the US policy regarding deterrence and reassurance. You've really inverted the view here and I think put the objectives and influence of US allies at the centre of the analysis. And you work through several case studies, as you've already mentioned. Tell us a little bit about this. You know, this offers substantial ground for analysis. And as you've already mentioned, the potential for synergies or convergences and divergences to emerge. You know, I'd be keen to know what, if anything, surprised you as you were researching these very different case studies.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. And I think that the main takeaway, I think, for us certainly was, I mean, just how different each of the US alliances was in relation to nuclear weapons. I mean, you've got Japan and the US making informal private arrangements at quite detailed level about close cooperation that were kept deliberately out of the public eye. And so that gap between private cooperation and what was said in public was by far larger in Japan than in any other alliance. On the other hand, you've got the almost total exclusion of South Korea from all things nuclear for much of the 20th century. Contrast that with Germany, for example, and how ingrained nuclear weapons cooperation during the Cold War was in the US-German relationship, and how much that was actually a constraint on the US, in the sense that the US couldn't actually push NATO to adopt a much stronger conventional posture in the 1960s, because it actually the integration of nuclear weapons was a constraint on them as much as on the Allies. On the other hand, Norway then kind of carved out its special place in Norway in NATO by refusing to engage with nuclear sharing, and had a very different kind of view on the strategic role of nuclear weapons. So almost 5 completely different stories there. And I think the second point there is then that nuclear, I think it raises the question of what actually is nuclear strategy. We're kind of accustomed to thinking about nuclear strategy in the way that it comes out of US NPRs, nuclear posture reviews. But what this book really shows is that in an alliance context, nuclear strategy is, if you like, a narrative that gives political meaning to defense cooperation. And that political meaning can be very different for the allies from different points of views. And so I think that, and that's I think a common theme. So if you look at flexible response and the way that Germany and the US interpreted this concept very differently, you've actually got a parallel, I think, in terms of in Australia today, in the sense this very quirky approach by Australia that we define what extended nuclear deterrence means only in our own white papers, and have a almost sole purpose approach to this that is quite at odds to the way that the US looks at nuclear strategy. And it most definitely comes out in the case of Norway, which used the fact that it was hesitant to engage or put boundaries around engaging on nuclear weapons cooperation in NATO, to almost define a geopolitical view of nuclear strategy that it then used to forestall and counter Soviet pressure on the Finns and the Swedes. So that question of what actually is nuclear strategy, I think, is an interesting question. And I think in this context, then a second thing is that the book, I think, challenges some of the conventional wisdom on nuclear cooperation with regard to the importance of hardware cooperation, or nuclear sharing, and policy dialogues. And there's an established narrative in the literature, and that ultimately also underpins US policy today as it's developed nuclear extended deterrence dialogues in Northeast Asia, that the US was ultimately unsuccessful in managing entrapment and abandonment dilemmas in the 50s and 60s through nuclear sharing, and that in the 70s and 80s, policy dialogues in the nuclear planning group and so on were much more successful in doing that, and hence a predisposition to look to policy dialogues today to manage deterrence discussions rather than material cooperation. But I think what the book shows is that that's actually a too narrow view, because it was actually the nuclear sharing that established itself in NATO, that started in the 50s and 60s, that created the very real dilemmas that the US had to address through the nuclear planning group. So ultimately, it's not an either or. It was actually, NATO was so successful in the second half exactly because of the hardware sharing. And I think that there are some lessons there today as we look at the future and managing those kinds of tensions in alliances in the future. And the good news, though, is that the US throughout history has used nuclear weapons cooperation to shore up confidence and consensus in alliances on the broad strategic questions that go far beyond the material issues relating to nuclear weapons that were discussed. And I think that ultimately it's at times when US and its allies look to the same threats, but had different assessments on the consequences or how to meet them, that we saw those advances of institutionalization and closer cooperation across all alliances. And I think that that's probably, if you look at where we are currently in the Indo-Pacific, a sign that the story that's traced out in this book isn't quite over yet and will continue.
Mm. Thank you for that. And we don't want to give everything away. We do want people to pick up a copy of the book and read through those 5 different stories. And I think you're right, there's such differences to emerge, but also, real synergies, particularly around agency and in each of those cases, the agency of allies. Hugh, I think it's time to bring you in. And before we do, I just want to note it's really great to see so many people joining this conversation. So thank you again. We will, I hope, have time for some questions from the audience. We're just using the chat function if you want to pop your questions in there, and I'll put them to our speakers, our panelists. Of course, at the very end, there might be a little bit of time if you want to have a chat as well after the official proceedings of this launch. But Hugh, let's come to you. Really keen to hear your reflections. In particular, I guess, how does this book relate to what we're seeing in the world today, a world in which US allies and others face increasingly an uncertain, contested kind of environment?
Yeah, well, great question, Caitlin. And should I say, look, it's great to be here with you and with my old friends and colleagues, Stefan and Andrew, and to be involved in the launching of this book, which I've really enjoyed reading. And look, it is a pretty important and also rather unusual book because, there are lots of books on the shelves now about alliances and about the US alliances and about how those remarkable institutions evolved and developed and shaped the world we're in today. And there are lots of books about nuclear strategy. But what Stefan and Andrew did was to identify a pretty significant, rather surprising gap in the literature. That is this question, which they've just been both describing to us very eloquently, and that is how the US and its allies have negotiated the role of nuclear weapons in their relationship and in their security. And it turns out to be a surprisingly complex and interesting and instructive story. And of course, it's instructive right now because nuclear issues, I have the sense at least, that nuclear issues are sort of zooming back into the center of our strategic concerns at a pretty alarming rate. I mean, one doesn't want to over dramatize these things, but in Europe, as we speak, there are Russian armored divisions on the border of Ukraine. And at the same time, a new government is being installed in Germany, or will soon be installed in Germany, which has, amongst other things, it seems, very deep doubts about whether to maintain Germany's capacity to deliver US nuclear weapons under the nuclear sharing arrangements, which the origins and evolution of which Stefan and Andrew have developed in such an interesting way in the German chapter. And at the same time, of course, in Asia, we see a kind of a gathering recognition that there's nothing anyone can do about North Korea's nuclear capability. And so we have a new nuclear power in Asia. And of course, there's been huge focus just in the last few days, really, on the extraordinary development of China's nuclear capabilities. China always been seen as a kind of only semi-nuclear power, really, certainly nothing comparable to the US or the Russians, but we now see with immense new missile fields, with the development of really rather surprising hypersonic technology, and with the new assessment just last week, was it, that China's stockpile of warheads is likely to reach 1,000 by the end of the decade, which in strategic policy terms is the day after tomorrow. This is this is a new salience for strategic nuclear questions. That means new salience in the US-China strategic competition, and it means that the new Cold War is actually a bit more like the old Cold War than people seem to have hoped. And I mean, that's just all a long way of saying that anyone who thought that with the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons were going to be durably less significant in mediating the key global strategic issues has proved to be disappointed. They're right back. And all of this, of course, raises very big questions for America, for America's allies, the way in which the United States and its allies manages their conversations and their cooperation around nuclear weapons, the role of nuclear weapons in what their alliances seek to achieve. And it's really vital to the US and to its allies, and therefore to the whole global order, that these new issues which have been raised by this new salience of nuclear weapons should be effectively handled. And that's where the book comes in, because certainly to my knowledge, it gives the best account we've got of how these issues have been negotiated in the past and how the status quo from which we're starting in many key areas like Germany and Japan and Australia, South Korea, where we're starting from. And it does turn out to be, I mean, as Stefan mentioned this in the things that surprised him, it turns out to be the story that Andrew and Stefan have brought together through studying their cases turns out to be more complex, more intriguing, quite surprising in some ways, by the way in which these relationships have evolved, a very complex interplay of strategic circumstances and perceptions, threat perceptions, of military strategies and different approaches to military strategies, of very important differences in domestic politics, of some significant, quite deep cultural questions. And of course, as Andrew mentioned, the role of individuals, which is, inherently unpredictable, but extremely important. And all of that's brought down to not just, as Stefan touched on, not just the sort of practical hardware-y questions, but the institutional questions about how far allies can influence US strategy, how far US can influence allies' strategic choices, what kind of forums and institutions function. And, it does transpire, amongst other things, these questions are, really quite deep. The issues are often shadowy, partly because they're often there's a lot of security around some of the issues, but also because they go to very deep and visceral political questions. And they're very diverse because those factors that I just touched on, which they articulate, strategic circumstance and perceptions, domestic politics, culture, and individuals, are so different from the different allies. And one of the really fascinating things, as both Stefan and Andrew have mentioned in their comments so far, is how diverse, how much difference there is between the way different allies negotiated that. I mean, you can see that in the pairs. It's fascinating, for example, viewed from a distance, you think Japan and South Korea, two peas in a pod. No, what Stefan and Andrew have brought out is that the way the Japanese and the South Koreans manage their strategic, the nuclear element of their different alliances with the United States, radically different. And likewise, Germany and Norway. I mean, I found, partly because I knew less about those cases to start with, I found that particularly interesting. And of course, Australia itself turns out to be a very interesting case study. I sort of wish they'd done a chapter on New Zealand, I must say, because I think that would have been the story had a different ending, but maybe that's the next chapter or the next book. Anyway, I mean, let me just finish by making an observation about what some of this seems to me to mean for Asia, because in the light of the point I just made earlier about the new salience of nuclear questions in the strategic rivalries that we've seen developing in Asia over the last decade and very quickly over the last couple of years, it is clear that both the US and America's allies have some very big choices to make over the next few years. There are questions about the strength of credibility of US extended deterrent guarantees to its Asian allies in the face both of the development of North Korea's capacity to strike the US homeland and of China's capacity to strike the US homeland. And so there's a sort of a fundamental challenge to the maintenance of the credibility of US extended deterrence, nuclear deterrence, which has always been there, but the strength of the challenges varies, and it seems to me to be going up at the moment. It also, I think, these new circumstances demand of allies how they rethink their approach to the evolution of US strategy, because what it's going to require of them to remain effective US allies, if that's what they choose to do, in helping the US to maintain its position in Asia. It does seem to me that, for example, and this is very relevant, this is a subject in which there's a lot of information in the book about these sorts of issues. One of the questions that's facing America is the extent to which it should enhance its capacity to fight a regional nuclear war with China as China's capacity to fight a regional nuclear war expands. And that has some resonances, although also some significant differences with many of the challenges that the US faced in the Cold War, in their last Cold War, particularly in Europe. And that's going to raise really nuggety questions, like the extent to which America's Asian allies would be willing to accept intermediate range nuclear forces on their own territory. And I might say, especially for Australia, because for the first, unlike every other ally that they studied, for Australia today, for the first time since 1942, Australia's strategic geography is directly relevant to America's military deployments. As Stefan and Andrew say, one of the differences between Australia and all the other cases they study is that we've been so remote that the same sorts of questions that have arisen for everybody else, because, you know, Norway, Germany, Japan, South Korea, they've all been frontline states. We haven't been, at least not since Coral Sea, the Battle of Coral Sea. And so for the first time, our geography is acquiring a salience which it hasn't had before, and which I think is going to see us facing questions from the United States about the sorts of support we provide to the US strategic posture, which is going to require us to make some decisions and find ourselves in the kind of very complex negotiations which the book sets out, I think really describes so very tellingly. So for all of those reasons, I do think it's a great book. It's a very timely book. And I think it's one that both the policymakers as well as the analysts need to spend a fair bit of time with.
Thank you, Hugh. And I'd like to pick up on the issue of the Australian experience, actually, and just draw out some of those tensions. You know, I think that's really fascinating that you're talking about these new strategic circumstances, and Australia will be front and centre in having to think about those. I can also see some questions coming through on the chat. The other thing is, if you prefer not to write your question, pop a note in the chat and I can ask you to unmute and deliver your question to our panelists yourself as well. So feel free to do that. Before we come to those questions, Hugh, let's pick up on Australia's experience. And the authors note, and I quote, "The role of US nuclear weapons in Australia's US alliance is defined by a paradox. Although successive governments have valued the long-term reassurance provided by US extended nuclear deterrence, the alliance lacks institutional architecture to manage nuclear weapons cooperation." I wonder if you can reflect on this. I mean, you've been on the front lines to some degree of this space, particularly in your role as senior advisor to the Defence Minister and Prime Minister in the 80s and 90s, and as Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Department of Defence. So what's your take? How do you reflect on this paradox in the Australian experience?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I mean, I think that the passage you quoted captures the so to speak the felt experience, the lived experience very, very precisely. Because of course, you know, there is this paradox, isn't there? That I'll just express a bit differently. That is, in some ways, we keep on saying it, don't we? That Australia is one of America's closest allies in the whole world, and there's all that sort of emotional depth to the alliance, and not just emotional, I mean political depth and so on. There's a very strong sense of alignment and commitment on both sides, I think. But on the other hand, you know, Australia, again, touching on what I said before, since 1942 hasn't felt particularly threatened. We've been a long way from the main spheres of conflict. Nothing like the kind of exposure to the harsh reality of the Cold War that all of the other allies that Stefan and Andrew examine in the book experience. And so it's a combination of real intensity of an alliance experience in some ways, and a kind of distance on the other. A kind of a, you know, you'd think from the way in which we talk about the alliance that we had this huge actual physical and institutional commitment. But as Stefan and Andrew point out in the book, in fact, Australia has the institutional infrastructure that underpins the management of the alliance, compared with what's there in Germany, for example, or Japan, is extremely light. And of course, apart from that, one of the reasons is we have not had US combat forces based on our soil since the battle against Japan moved north in the mid-40s. So I think you know, there is this sort of paradox, and that was shown up in the fact that although Australia, you know, really did sign up to support the United States in the Cold War in the abstract, so to speak, particularly after 1972 or 1975, the opening to China or the end of the Vietnam War. Again, it's a point that Stefan and Andrew make in the book. For us, we really felt the Cold War was over. And so issues like extended nuclear deterrence, terribly critical for Japan, or terribly critical for Korea or Germany or Norway. For us, it was a little bit hypothetical. And it's interesting, and they draw this out and describe it, I think, quite well. It was only actually after the end of the Cold War that we in government, as I then was, thought that we needed to go to start talking about extended nuclear deterrence as an element of the alliance. The alliance was, we were silent about extended nuclear deterrence. It just wasn't something we talked about. We always kind of took it for granted, but it was after the end of the Cold War that we in defence started thinking, gee, we may be better just start articulating this proposition. We didn't want to take it for granted. And we wanted to start getting a little bit of documentation around it. And as they describe in the chapter in the book, we took a rather unusual approach to doing that, which suited our circumstances. But it was a reflection of that, kind of that paradox of an emotionally close alliance that didn't actually have much strategic substance until now. And that's what's changing right now, it seems to me, as we become again a kind of a frontline state in a major strategic contest for primacy in Asia.
Thank you for that. Thank you for just unpacking much of that for us, Hugh. And it is time to come to questions from the audience. I do note we have Gareth Evans, former Australian Foreign Minister and Chancellor of the ANU, in the audience. Gareth, I know you've got, rich depth of experience and strong views in this space. And I've got a comment through from you about, if we're serious about nuclear risk reduction, what conceivable justification is there for Australia and other allies resisting Biden's instinct to move to a no first use sole purpose doctrine in the current US nuclear posture review? I wondered if you'd like to speak to that a little further. We might put that question then to our panelists, but thank you for that. Andrew, can I draw you in on this point?
Sure, yeah. So I'm happy to address the question around NFU, or no first use. And perhaps, it does align a little bit, I think, with the previous question in the chat too, around the ban treaty, why Australia shouldn't sign up for that. And I guess the answers to these questions really depend on what your views are on the question of whether nuclear weapons are a stabilizing force and whether deterrence actually does provide certain nuclear deterrence, that is, does provide certain guardrails in relationships, particularly relationships between great powers, and especially in a context where you have a significant transition underway in the international system. On the issue of no first use, we know that the Americans are getting close to finalising the nuclear posture review and the first, or the NPR of the Biden administration. We know that Biden himself has articulated sympathy with NFU, certainly with sole purpose, which is sort of a derivative of that. But we also know that US allies are pretty much in agreement that it's a bad idea, simply because of the view that, why would you place additional caveats on the circumstances in which and the means with which the US would defend your sovereignty if it was threatened? And the reality, of course, is that, most allies kind of, when it comes to the crunch, say, well, no, we're not really up for that. Why would we do that? And I think that's a totally rational and logical view, despite the fact that many of these same allies, including Australia, do have, do support nuclear disarmament in the longer term through phased reduction. So, in my view, the two aren't mutually exclusive. But the other issue here, of course, is that, I think looking at who's advocating no first use, essentially the biggest advocates of NFU are those people sitting inside the Washington Beltway, the arms control community, some of whom are quite open in saying we don't believe allies should have a veto over US nuclear policy. So there's a sort of view that, well, yeah, the allies are important, but their views on nuclear weapons should be discounted. So I think it will be interesting to see how this transpires, whether Biden who will have the ultimate say over the NPR, obviously, and the key elements within it, will prevail, or whether, as some predict, he will be convinced by the Pentagon that's now really starting to push back against this notion that the US should place caveats on its security assurances. On the ban treaty, look, again, I'm quite skeptical in the sense, I think both for sort of substantive reasons. This is a treaty that does not have a verification mechanism, for example. So why would any state sign up to it? No nuclear weapons state has currently signed on to it. And it really doesn't address the question around what we would do with those sort of outliers like North Korea. And so, I think there are real problems with the ban treaty.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks for picking up on Michelle's question around the ban treaty. Thank you, Michelle, for the question. Stefan, can I just come to you? Is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, look, no, I think the no first use is likely to be a very interesting. The way that those discussions shape up is going to be very interesting in light of what we're discussing in the book. And I think that there's a few kind of considerations that would come from the history that maybe aren't so much yet in the discussion on this currently. I mean, one is, I think, on a positive note, the question of, if you look at the Norwegian case, should the US adopt the no first use doctrine? I mean, how much geostrategic leverage could that give them by virtue of the possibility of rolling that back again? And I think that that's kind of like where the Norwegian case ended up, that there was a deliberate reluctance to, or they deliberately didn't move as far as they could on nuclear issues, and then try to use that as leverage for restraint on the Soviet side. And I think that if you look for arguments in the book on why no first use could be a good idea, I think they're certainly looking at that Nordic balance kind of like context and some good news. I think on the other hand, there's probably less good news in the sense that what the book, I think, shows is that US allies, it raises the question as to whether you can take nuclear guarantees out of an alliance without fundamentally kind of challenging the confidence in the alliance. And I think that the fact that a no first use guarantee essentially means that for the first time in 70 years, the US would put a formal limit to the extent to which it would support its allies, whether that would not change fundamentally the view of what we think the US actually sees an alliance as being at its heart. I think that's kind of like the corollary to the US using nuclear integration to address challenges about alliance confidence. I think it means that if you start tweaking on the nuclear side, you do raise those fundamental questions. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been done before, and I think there are parallels. If you look at the story that we lay out in the book about McNamara reducing, moving to flexible response in the early 1960s, they raised concerns that are probably as big, if not bigger, than concerns about no first use now. And the way that the US ultimately kind of like managed to agree to gain agreement from the allies was to really sit down and through detailed studies, joint studies, come to agreement on the underlying assumptions. So, I mean, that was US-German study groups trying to work out what are your assumptions about how big a Soviet attack we can actually defend against with conventional means, from what point out, how many divisions does it have to be before we really need nuclear weapons? There's some fundamental underlying analytical assumptions that they actually worked out and that was ultimately formed the basis of the consensus. And as part of that, the US made concessions such as the guarantee never to reduce US nuclear weapons in Europe unless there's consensus in the alliance to do so. So there was a significant strategic give, and that guarantee remains until today. So I think if the US is serious about doing no first use, if you look at the story in the book, it may actually require a significant step up in the institutionalization and integration in the alliances that we're also not really seeing yet today.
Hugh, did you want to add into this conversation?
Well, thank you. Yes, I was kind of itching to, because it is a pretty interesting subject. And as Andrew mentioned, I mean, the question of no first use, on which Gareth has been very eloquent for a long time, is right on the cusp now with the preparation of the new nuclear posture review in Washington. Look, I think the point that I think Andrew was making, and Stefan too, I guess, that the argument against no first use, against the US making a no first use declaration, is that it would fundamentally change the nature and arguably undermine the credibility of US alliances in places like in Asia and in Europe, where US allies face a nuclear armed power on their doorstep, and that would potentially drive fundamental and not particularly savoury changes in the international order. And that's a significant factor. But I've got to say, although I don't think this is an argument that Gareth would necessarily endorse, I do think there's a different argument in favour of America abandoning the option of using nuclear weapons first. And that is that I don't think it's a credible threat. I don't think the idea that the United States would today, for example, in a US-China war over Taiwan, be willing, were its conventional forces to fail, to use nuclear weapons against China. I don't think that's a credible threat, because China's capacity to retaliate against the continental United States is so clear. And that's one of the differences between the new Cold War and the old Cold War. In the old Cold War, it was clear that America was willing to accept a major nuclear attack on continental United States in order to preserve its position in Europe. It's far from clear that America today is prepared to accept a major nuclear attack on the continental United States in order to preserve its position in Asia, because China is not the kind of threat that the Soviet Union was at the height of the Cold War. And my reservation about America preserving its first use options is that it gives US policymakers the illusion that they can prevail in a war against China when they can't win it conventionally. And I don't think they can anymore because of China's growing maritime capability. And therefore makes the United States more likely to start a war, which I think on balance they'd be dumb to start, maybe wiser to avoid. Now that itself, of course, has very devastating implications for the future of the regional order in Asia. But if I'm given the choice of moving to a new regional order in Asia via a nuclear war or without going via a nuclear war, I'd rather take the second option. And I think abandoning first use, making a no first use declaration, would help make that less undesirable outcome more likely.
It goes to that core of changing circumstances too, doesn't it? And how we actually approach some of the analysis behind these issues. Now, you've mentioned China and Asia, and John Blaxland has put a question here again too. I'll start, Andrew and Stefan, with you again, but he's interested to hear your views on President Xi's assertion that he's ready to sign ASEAN's nuclear arm-free zone, or sign up to. Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to say a couple of things on that. And I guess my response probably won't surprise people who know my views on these things. I mean, I think the timing is everything, of course, with AUKUS. I think Beijing's is a good opportunity here to exploit some of the concern in Southeast Asia around how Australia and the US and the UK, but particularly Australia, has managed /messaged AUKUS, and I don't think we've done a particularly good job in the region at engaging and consulting and reassuring neighbours that this is not directed at them, particularly Indonesia. I think the Chinese move at this point is pretty transparent, for all of China's sort of movement on this, would anyone seriously believe that the Chinese wouldn't deploy nuclear weapons into the region if it was in their strategic interests? I don't think there's any single Southeast Asian country that would, hand on heart, believe that, irrespective of what China says.
Andrew, I love that you stick to that really good principle of effective diplomacy. No surprises. Nice. And thank you for taking on that question. Stefan, anything to add there?
I thought I might take the one. There's a question here about the US neither confirm nor deny policy and whether that's what's strategically worthwhile. And I think that, obviously there's a lot of considerations that went to into that posture that the US never confirmed with regards to a specific vessel, whether it carried nuclear weapons or not. But I think that there's a broader kind of like interesting issue here, because it may well come back. If you look at the 2018 nuclear posture review, the US is and Biden has continued to fund that return of a sea-launched nuclear cruise missile on US attack submarines. I mean, I for a variety of reasons think that's a good idea. I think that reasonable people can reasonably disagree on that, but it certainly means that that question of of whether US Navy vessels will be nuclear armed or not may well make a return. And I think that it was an interesting debate in the 1980s, obviously because of the consequences for New Zealand, but also because of the link to NATO. And I think that there is a strong argument that the US cut New Zealand out in order to kind of deter, if you like, Scandinavian allies, in particular Denmark, who was in a much more in a position to follow. And actually, the Danish government resigned once in the 1980s, once Parliament said that once Parliament, the Folketing decided that they should follow the New Zealand example rather than implement that and threaten the alliance. So I think that what this shows is that those domestic constraints on allies are very real. And I think that we need to be careful when we look at the Cold War of, I think, even in a sense of being triumphalist, in the sense that we won the Cold War in the end, we knew how to do it. Because if you actually look at US alliances and nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, there were crises all over the place, from disarmament, strong support for disarmament in New Zealand and Denmark, and to including Germany. I mean, and it's often forgotten now that German-US relations were abysmal after the US signed the INF Treaty, to the point that, as we'll detail in the book, I mean, the German government actually stopped NATO command exercises over US refusal to kind of like accommodate German preferences on when and how to use nuclear weapons. So the German Chancellor Kohl like personally intervened and stopped those NATO exercises in 1989 over those disagreements. And I mean, those are kind of like tensions that we certainly haven't seen ever since, and that I think need to kind of like induce a sense of caution about whether the answer to managing those kinds of tensions in the Cold War really lies in the Cold War, let alone that they necessarily can be successfully managed.
Mm. Thanks, Stefan, for that. And I think drawing out those tensions again in the relationships is a really core part of what you do through all of those case studies. And it's a fascinating read as well. I'd like to direct the next question, Hugh, to you. It's come from Carl Rhodes, and it comes back to this idea of an increasingly threatening strategic environment. And given this, and with numbers of nuclear weapons in Asia and threats of further proliferation, is there a role for national missile defence for Australia?
Look, it's a reasonable question, but I'm going to have to give what I would, at least at any rate, would regard as a demoralising answer, and that is no, on what you might call engineering grounds, and that is that as the United States has discovered over many decades and many billions of dollars, defending a continental-sized target, particularly from longer range, higher flying, faster descending missiles or warheads, is extraordinarily, against anything more than a handful of incoming weapons, a very small handful, is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. And I think Australia could end up spending billions and billions of dollars, even more than we're planning to spend on our new submarines, and end up with a very low level of confidence that we could stop an incoming nuclear strike. And therefore, I just don't think we get much for our money. In the end, I think Australia does have to think very carefully about the nature of our vulnerability to nuclear blackmail in the event that we lose confidence in US extended nuclear deterrence, which I don't think is that unlikely. But I don't think ballistic missile defences provide a solution to that.
And one final question, this really comes from Ben Zala. Andrew, I'm going to direct this question to you. So Ben's interested to know whether you found much about Allied views on arms control, and particularly the supposed demise of strategic arms control lately. Is there much variation across the countries in your case studies in their views on the importance or otherwise of arms control?
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Ben, for the question. Look, I think it is, there is a degree of variation across the cases, both in terms of the cases themselves, but also how individual US allies have reacted over time. I mean, I think it's fair to say that most US allies most of the time want a Goldilocks formula. So they want arms control, they want the US to be sort of negotiating and engaged, but they don't want the Americans to sort of trade away the family silver either when it comes to sort of key weapon systems and, you know, to sort of cut side deals with the Soviet Union or China. And sort of in the current context, you know, I think it's pretty clear the Japanese have fairly firm views about the US, for example, acknowledging China as a peer competitor in the nuclear domain. And that sort of acts, I think, to constrain the US a little bit. And so the Americans have approached it from the perspective of engaging China in a trilateral process with Russia instead. Now, whether that continues or not, who knows? You know, I think in the Australian context, for example, I mean, the Hawke government and particularly Labor governments were quite clear during the Cold War that they saw Australia's sort of involvement in the US deterrence enterprise, if we could put it like that, through the joint facilities as being, you know, the quid pro quo was the Americans engaging in arms control with the Soviet Union, and so that was a you know, a fairly big expectation. NATO during the 1970s and the strategic arms limitation talks was interesting, and Stefan might want to say a little bit more about this in a minute, but you know, they weren't unhappy about, NATO allies weren't unhappy about SALT, but you know, some, particularly Helmut Schmidt, for example, in West Germany, was kind of nervous again that the Americans would sort of cut a side deal with the Soviets and sort of trade away European security as a result for that, and then you get the sort of push, the momentum for nuclear modernization in NATO to sort of compensate for doubts about US decoupling. So, you know, there's a sort of, you know, I would like to provide a straight answer to Ben's question, but actually it's complicated and it varies over time. Stefan, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
I think
yeah, I can. I mean, I guess just on that point on the SALT, I think that's a really interesting one, because ultimately European allies were very concerned about Carter's regard for their security interests. They were concerned about them trading away the cruise missiles. And the way that the US responded to that was not by addressing those concerns in the strategic arms limitations talk, but to actually use NATO tactical nuclear weapons modernization as a sign of confidence and pushing that. So, and I think this is a good example where you actually see the US using nuclear weapons cooperation as a way of addressing broader concerns about US policy that we're kind of trying to like draw out in the book.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that, Stefan. I guess this actually brings us close to the close of today's presentation. And I'd like to bring Hugh back in now, really to take forward the official launch of the book. And Hugh, I guess give us a sense of why people need to read this book and what are the highlights that you think they really need to take notice of?
Well, thanks, Caitlin. Yes, this is a book launch, so we have to launch the book. And I mean, I think the conversation we've had so far has been, you know, has done a very good job, thanks to your moderation of bringing out why the book is important and why the issues are topical, and how lucky we are to have scholars like Andrew and Stefan, who of course have both, each of them have both separately and together have a very long tradition, a very good track record of writing about these sorts of issues. But I think the fact that they've brought these questions together in this book is particularly important and topical right now. So I really would encourage you all to read it. I'm sure I don't need to do that because I think they'll have encouraged you by what they've had to say about the book today, but I really would encourage you to read and to buy it, of course, that's important as well. And so it's my great pleasure and honor and to declare the book officially launched. I hope it does as well as it deserves.
Thank you very much. You send forth emoji love from across the reaches of this platform if you'd like. Look, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, this brings us really to the close of today's launch. I'd like to just give a couple of thank yous to some important people. Hugh, of course, to you as our guest speaker, thank you for generously sharing your insights and expertise. To our authors, Stefan and Andrew, thanks also and congratulations on the book. As one reviewer put it, it widens the aperture of contemporary debates and provides a really valuable perspective for academics and policymakers alike. And I think given the changing circumstances, certainly in this part of the world, we're all going to need as much support as we can in thinking through those big strategic questions. It certainly is a book that delves into those big issues of power, influence, interests and agency, and as Andrew's already said, it's complicated, and we need to spend some time in that space. I should note that in the chat, a couple of people have suggested they'd like to see chapters on New Zealand, Canada and the UK. So look forward to the launch of the revised edition when you're able to bring those case studies into this picture. And I'd also just like to make a quick thank you to those who are behind the scenes at ANU in the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. Michelle and Kian, thank you for bringing today's event together and for supporting this event. And of course, finally, to all of you in the audience, it's really great to have you all joining us for today's discussion and putting your questions and comments forward. I hope you are able to enjoy reading this book forward. Christmas is coming, put it on your Christmas list. Feel free to stick around for a couple of minutes of networking if you'd like, and to chat with people in the room. We'd really encourage you to do that. That's really all from me. Otherwise, stay safe. And for those joining us from the US, happy Thanksgiving as well. There we are.